Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the Flins pre-release analysis. Before we get into any of the details, I made an in-depth guide that covers pretty much everything. There's a few things specifically that I cover in the guide that I think are missing from most guides out there. Mainly, investment priority list of like a general benchmark of how much he likes each stat and what order to invest into him. And also, I have stat targets at 2 different levels of investment so that you can kind of compare to your stat targets and see if there's something wrong. Mainly, I think it happens very often that people do the wrong rotations, but they don't even realize them. And so the purpose of this is to both, have a goal in mind of what stats you're trying to reach, but also I'm including damage numbers that you would see with those stats so that you can compare what you're getting in game to those numbers and ask yourself, am I getting those numbers with those stats or am I getting lower? Anyways, the guide is like very in-depth. I put a lot of work into it. So if the pre-release doesn't cover everything that you wanted to know about him, go check it out. But without further ado, we can get into the actual pre-release. So, base HP 12,491, base defense 809, base attack 352, crit damage ascension stat. He's an electro polearm. His defensive stats are fairly normal for a carry. Carries have gotten defensive stats on the higher side a lot more recently. This follows this trend. He has fairly high base defense mainly, but his base HP is okay as well. So you shouldn't see any particular issues in terms of vulnerability because of the defensive stats. So what does Flins do? Normal attack, worthless. This is completely useless. You shouldn't even level it up. Next, his skill, Ancient Rite, Arcane Light. Flins summons forth the ancient power concealed within his lamp and switches to his Manifest Flame form. This form has the following characteristics. Flins' normal and charge attacks deal electro damage that cannot be overridden, and he is unable to perform plunge attacks. His interruption resistance is increased, and his skill is replaced with a special skill. Think of it like a claw-hind skill, where you use the skill to enter a stance that gives you electro attacks, and while you're in that stance, your skill button is replaced with an actual ability that does something. Right? In Clawhind's case, it's dashing forward, and in Flins' case, it's Northland Spear Storm. Flins summons a flurry of spears in front, dealing AoE electro damage and causing his elemental burst to be replaced with the special elemental burst for the next 6 seconds. There's a lot of steps to Flins' kit. It's not actually that complicated. Once he has used his special skill, the equivalent of that Clawhind Lunge, he makes it so that he can use a mini burst, just like Verissa can after doing an enhanced plunge attack. The special skill cooldown, unlike Clawhind, has an actual cooldown, and that cooldown is 6 seconds. That 6-second cooldown cannot be reduced by cooldown reduction effect, so Thundering Fury, or just like CDR stat from Chongyun's C2 from Animal Resonance, those things don't affect the cooldown of this special skill. Cooldown reduction effect will affect the cooldown of his actual skill overall. This 16-second skill cooldown is what will get reduced, not the 6-second Northland Spear Storm. Looking at the actual numbers, the normal attacks are pretty pathetic. They're not like completely terrible, but they're not good either. And as we're gonna see later, they also scale with different stats than his main source of damage. So generally, those normal attacks are gonna tickle. They're gonna be less than 10% of your DPS. He also has a charge attack, but honestly, there's no real reason to use it. Like, it's possible that his best combos will include some charge attacks, because it's possible that the charge attack is better than just spamming normal attacks, but it'll kind of be like the difference between doing a normal attack on your Bennett because you're on swap cooldown. That's what min-maxing his normal attack combos does. So the charge attack is pretty much worthless. You don't really care about it. The Northland Spear Storm itself is 300 motion value. This is still pretty damn low. For comparison, Verissa's skill, the enhanced one, is around 200, but Verissa actually builds damage percent, whereas Flins won't. So generally, this is gonna hit for a smaller number than Verissa's skill. Basically, none of these numbers really matter. The main purpose of his skill is to enable the special skill, the Northland Spear Storm. It has a 6-second cooldown, and the stance change lasts for 10 seconds, which means that you will only be able to fit 2 special skills inside the stance. That being said, you have a bit of flexibility on when exactly, right? Because if you use it at the very start, 6 seconds later, the cooldown will be over and you'll have 4 seconds remaining to your skill stance. So you can either use it immediately or wait a little bit. That does mean that he's not going to be particularly vulnerable to things that will interrupt him. He's not going to be too reliant on defensive utility because you don't really get punished very hard for having to dodge. His actual normal attack combos are worthless and pathetic, and on top of that, you can still do his rotation as short as can possibly be done, even if you slightly delay your second skill, or your first one, for that matter. Anyways, I've said that his skill itself doesn't matter, but I haven't talked about what it actually allows you to do. The Northland Spearstorm itself doesn't do much, but it enables you to use his mini burst, the Thunderous Symphony. I'll be referring to it as the mini burst throughout this video, or the special burst, but mainly the mini burst. So, what is Thunderous Symphony? Consumes less energy than his actual total burst cost. To unleash a special elemental burst, Flins deals a single instance of AoE electro damage that is considered Lunar Charge damage. The fact that it's considered Lunar Charge damage means that it does not scale with damage percent. Instead of scaling with damage percent, it will scale with your Lunar Charge damage bonuses, which is what you get from direct sources of Lunar Charge damage, but also from Elemental Mastery. Moon Sign Ascendant Gleam. So, Nograi is introducing racist resonances. We've had elemental resonances in the past, but Nograi is introducing an additional team building explicit mechanic. And the question is basically just, do you have one Nograi character, or do you have more than one? If you have more than one, you'll be an Ascendant, otherwise you won't be. Moon Sign Ascendant Gleam. If you have at least one other Nograi character with Flins, Flins' skill is Enhanced. If there are thunderclouds nearby, which means if you have triggered the Lunar Charge reaction in the past 8-ish seconds, Flins will deal an additional instance of Lunar Charge AoE electro damage. The first one is 121.5%. The second one is 176.7%. So if you're in Ascendant Gleam, you do more than double damage. Now, if you're not familiar with how Lunar Charge works, these numbers might look low to you. And that's understandable, because the way that Lunar Charge works is not very intuitive. Let's talk about the damage formula. Usually, on an attack scaling hit, what goes into the damage formula? Well, you have your attack, you have your damage percent, you have your crit, you have enemy resistance, you have enemy defense multiplier, and you have the motion value, the number on the talent. And then you can also have elemental mastery and elemental mastery multiplier if it's a reaction. Let's build a fictional character. Normal attack scaling character that gets 2500 attack. Most characters that care about damage percent hover between 100 and 150 damage percent generally. Let's say 150. Your crit value, let's say you're a 5-star character that ascends with crit. You got crit from your artifacts. Maybe your artifact set gives you crit, and maybe you got a weapon that gives you crit too. With 420 CV, you'll be at 100 crit rate, 220 crit damage, which will multiply your damage by 3.2, because all of your attacks will do 220% more damage times 3.2. For now, we just say that we don't have an EM multiplier, an attack that doesn't trigger a reaction. Most carries end up with Shred on their team. The default amount of Shred that you get is 40% from VV. Some carries get a bit less because they use different sources. Some carries get more because they use more than one source. For now, let's assume 1.15. Enemy defense multiplier is based on your level and the enemy's level. If you're level 90 against an enemy that's level 100, it's going to be 190 divided by 390. And then you have the talent value. For now, let's just say 100% on a given hit. And what your damage formula does is it takes your attack. It increases it by your damage percent. So it's your attack times 1 plus your damage percent, because it's increased by 150%, so it will be multiplied by 2.5. Then that crits, so this number is then multiplied by your crit multiplier. And then it can react, so this number is multiplied by your EM multiplier, if it reacts. In this case, it doesn't. Then this number gets multiplied by your resistance multiplier. In most teams where you have Shred against a default enemy that has 10% resistance to every element, is going to slightly increase it. And then this number gets multiplied by the enemy's defense multiplier, which will generally divide it by about 2. That number that you have then gets multiplied by the number on your talent, and this is the damage you deal to the enemy. When I do my calcs, I generally use a shortcut where I calculate this number. I do all of the steps except the last step of multiplying by your talent multiplier, and I add a line here. I call it the effective attack. Most people do it that way. And the effective attack is just putting everything together other than the last step. So this effective attack is going to be your attack times 1 plus your damage percent times your crit multiplier times your EM multiplier times your resistance multiplier times your defense multiplier. And we have it right here. This is normal damage. Let's explain how it works on Lunar Charge talent damage. Lunar Charge talent damage does not scale with damage percent, so this number is just going to be 0. That means instead of a damage percent goblet, you're going to go for something else. For now, let's assume you go for an attack goblet instead. So this attack is going to be higher, obviously. Let's assume that you get about 400 attack. You're at around 900 base attack, which is Flins on your average 4-star weapon. You get about 400 from a goblet. 2900. It still can crit the very same way, but now we have an EM multiplier from Lunar Charge. On top of that, Lunar Charge also has additional multipliers. First of those multipliers is Flins's, I guess it's his moon sign passive. When a party member triggers an Electro Charge reaction, it's converted to Lunar Charge, and every 100 attack that Flins has increases the base damage of Lunar Charge by 0.7% up to a maximum of 14%. This is a multiplicative times 1.14 to all Lunar Charge damage, as long as he has at least 2000 attack, which he will. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna take our EM multiplier and we're just gonna multiply it by 1.14. Ineffa has the same passive, and Ineffa is going to be an important part of Flins' best team. So let's just do 1.28 instead. Then we have the formula for the increase in the EM multiplier from building Elemental Mastery, which is 6 times EM divided by 2000 plus EM. But it starts by dealing 100% of its damage without an increase, so it's +1. Additionally, there are direct sources of Lunar Charge damage, such as Flins' Ascension 1 passive that increases Lunar Charge damage by 20% when you're in Ascendant Gleam, which you should always be, so plus 20%. You can get more. Ascendant Gleam by itself has an actual effect. It increases Lunar Charge damage based on the stats of your non- and Nod Cry characters on your team. Between 20 and 36 additional Lunar Charge damage bonus. For now, let's assume a team that runs 2 non-Nod Cry characters. When you run 2 non-Nod Cry characters, you'll generally max it out, and it caps at 36%. And Flins' new best craftable weapon, the Prospectors Shovel, also directly gives you Lunar Charge damage. 24% increase to 48 when you're in Ascendant Gleam, which again, you should always be. If you end up getting his signature, the signature also gives you Lunar Charge damage. It's 36 instead of 48, but both his default free-to-play option and his signature provide him more here. So 48% here. But on top of that, you also get a bunch of EM. How much though? Well, for now, let's assume no EM main stats. How much EM can you get just from substats and external effects? First, let's talk about Flins' last Ascension passive. Flins' Elemental Mastery is increased by 8% of his attack. The maximum increase obtainable this way is 160, which means it caps out at 2000 attack, which, like I said earlier, is pretty trivial to reach on Flins. So this is basically a permanent 160 EM. What else? Well, if you're playing Ineffa, Ineffa's Burst provides your active character with EM. So that's another, like, 150-ish. What else? The new Nogcry support set, which is what you are going to want to use, provides you with 120. What else? Sucrose. Sucrose provides you with around 200. What else? The new carry set in Nogcry is giving you 80. What else? Substats. Let's assume about 80 Elemental Mastery. And that gives you a default amount of EM without looking for it in main stats or on weapons of around 800, which makes your EM multiplier almost 5. Now, the resistance multiplier works the exact same way for Lunar Charge damage, but the defense multiplier does not. Lunar Charge damage does not get reduced by enemy defense. It bypasses defense entirely, so the defense multiplier will be 1. But then on top of that, Lunar Charge damage gets an additional property, which is that, for some reason, it gets multiplied by 3. It's just a nice little times 3. Now, since we want to compare a motion value for Lunar Charge damage to a motion value for normal damage, let's include that times 3 multiplier in the effective attack formula. And as you can see, at a similar level of investment, that number that gets multiplied by your motion value, straight up just 1 digit higher. Now the specific value is going to change, obviously. I've included a lot of EM buffs here. I haven't included alternative buffs everywhere here. Most of the time, you'll end up with a bit more attack buffs in these teams. You'll end up with maybe more damage percent from those, from a source or two. Let's say you have Cinder City on top of it. But it's still around 10 times higher. And so that same number will also be around 10 times higher. It's difficult to do a direct comparison, so take that times 10 number with a massive grain of salt, but it's a good approximation. What that means is that at talent level 9, his mini burst hits for 121 plus 176, so it's just shy of 300 motion value, or lunar charge damage. That's the equivalent of around 3000 motion value, or talent damage. That's a pretty good number. Flins is a character who concentrates almost all of his damage in this mini burst. When you look at his damage distribution, and this is something I used in the guide, his burst damage is almost 3/4 of his total DPS. The cost of this ability is 30 energy, and you can use it after using the Northland Spear Storm. The mini burst itself doesn't have a cooldown, but the trigger condition for the mini burst does have a cooldown. That cooldown is 6 seconds within a 10-second time frame, which means you can get upwards of 2 mini bursts per rotation. That will cost 60 energy. His base gameplay loop ends there. You use your skill to enter your Manifest Flame form. Then you have 10 seconds during which you need to fit 2 special skills followed by mini bursts. Once you've unleashed your second mini burst, you don't need to stay on Flins for any longer than that. However, Flins' particle generation is tied to the electro-infused normal attacks. So swapping out early is generally not ideal because you're probably losing energy, but also you might still be on a cooldown on your other characters. That being said, while that is where his base gameplay loop ends, he has another aspect to his kit, which is his actual big burst, Ancient Ritual Cometh the Night. Flins unleashes the true power of his lamp, which, by the way, good one. If that's the true power of his lamp kinda sucks. Dealing AoE electro damage, and after a short delay, dealing 2 instances of middle phase and 1 instance of final phase AoE electro damage, all of which are considered lunar charge damage. Moon Sign Ascended Gleam, this is enhanced. If there's a thundercloud nearby, he will deal an additional 2 instances of middle lunar charged AoE damage. The big burst is just a mini burst, but worse. The motion value for the mini burst is, at talent level 9, 121.5 plus 176.7. For the big burst, you have 4 instances of middle phase lunar charge damage, so 27.6 times 2, or times 4, and 1 instance of the final one, which is 198.8, which is 10% more motion value, 3% more damage. The mini burst also has an initial skill damage, but this is not lunar charge damage. Because it's not lunar charge damage, 1, it doesn't get multiplied by 10, which is a pretty big difference, but also Flins is a character that doesn't build damage percent. So this 309.2, you add the 441.7, but with all of the other stats being equal, it's at like 500k, which is the equivalent of the motion watt value was another like 15% higher maybe. In other words, the initial skill damage does less than 1 instance of the middle phase one. But we can approximate it as it being around 15% higher at 325 motion value, just for the sake of comparing his damage instances. So if it is 325, then the big burst does about 9-10% more damage than the mini burst. However, everything else about it is way worse. 1, it has an actual cooldown, and that cooldown is 20 seconds, which is long as hell. 2, it costs 80 energy, almost 3 times more than a mini burst. 3, it has a movie length animation. 4, it can miss. The AoE for it is really small, and it's easy for it to miss. With all of that in mind, does that mean you never use the big burst? No, it does not. Let's talk about Verissa, because Verissa also has a mini burst and a big burst. And in her case, you'd never use the big burst. The reason why you never use the big burst on Verissa is because, in Verissa's case, if you have extra energy that you can use after you've done your base rotation that allows you to get 2 bursts, you can start doing normal charge attacks. Okay, you. To enable an extra special skill that also enables an extra special burst. That additional mini burst is not gated by your cooldowns. Sure, it's gated by animation length to some extent, because the Verissa's charge attack is fairly slow, but you can add it into Verissa's baseline rotation. This means that if you generate more than the 60 energy required for 2 mini bursts on Verissa, you have a way to use that additional energy. The default amount of energy that you generate in a Verissa overload team generally hovers around 60 energy per rotation. However, it'll pretty much never go to 90. What that means is that the extra energy you get from ER stats on Verissa basically allows you to use 1 extra mini burst when available. It's not something you're ever forced to do, because she still does good damage without that 3rd mini burst, but it allows you the opportunity to capitalize on additional energy generation. And because you'll never really find yourself in a situation where you generate more energy than the 90 that you can consume on a 3 mini burst rotation, there's never a reason to use her big burst. On top of that, Verissa, unlike Flins, can actually still deal damage outside of her cooldowns, right? Flins' damage is pretty much entirely concentrated in his Lunar Charge. In other words, the burst animation time on Verissa is a much bigger DPS loss than it is on Flins, because your alternatives on Flins don't do anything, whereas on Verissa, they do something. Flins, unlike Verissa, does not have a way to add a 3rd mini burst. His trigger condition for the mini burst is to use an enhanced skill, and you cannot, without constellations, get a 3rd enhanced skill within your skill or your manifest flame form. What that means is that extra energy on Flins does not have a good conduit to be used. So if you're gonna use it at some point, it's gonna have to be on the big burst. And so, unlike Verissa, Flins actually has many different situations where he wants to use his big burst. Do keep in mind, your big burst is effectively just the equivalent of 1 more mini burst, so if using your big burst prevents you from doing a mini burst, it is not worth using. However, there's a problem. Let's talk about energy generation, and let's use Verissa as an example. First, I'm gonna do a normal Verissa rotation. Obviously, this team is not a real team, but we're gonna pretend like it is. You open your rotation, you do whatever you want to do here, whatever, very cool. Cog. Wow. For now, let's just use 2 mini bursts. And as you can see, when I swam back to Verissa, my energy is back to full. This means my ER requirements right now with 2 mini bursts, completely fine. Our ER requirements are met. Let's see what happens when we add the big burst at the start of the rotation. Don't have the energy. Have to skip it. I ended up getting 1 anyways. We just barely got the energy here from the additional hit. The reason for that is because a lot of our particle generation, it happens during our setup. Right? We generated a lot of energy during that setup. And the problem with Flins is that the same thing will happen for him. Some of your particle generation happens after your uptime is over. But if you want to use your burst while you're buffed, it effectively means that your ER requirements will increase from using the burst, right? You can't just think of it as, okay, I'm starting with full energy, I can start with my burst, and then I have my ER requirements. Because that particle generation happens while you're full energy with the burst, and then it doesn't happen again until after you swap out of Flins. In other words, instead of needing to generate 60 energy within 16 seconds, you now need to generate 60 energy within 10 seconds, which is going to increase the ER requirements. All of this, means that if you want to use the big burst, you need to be at a certain ER threshold that will be higher than your actual ER requirement. What is that threshold? Let's do an energy calc for a default Flins team. How many particles does Flins get? And the default Flins team that I will be using for pretty much all of this is going to be Flins, Ineffa, Sucrose, Aino. Flins' particle generation is he generates a particle when he normal attacks with Electro, right, during his skill. And that can only happen up to once every 2 seconds with a 10-second duration if you trigger it at the very start of your skill. And then every 2.34-ish seconds after that, you can get 5 particles before the skill is over. And obviously, he'll be catching all of those particles. You also have Ineffa. Ineffa's skill has a 66% chance to generate a particle every time it hits, every 2 seconds. In other words, you generate about 1 particle every 3 seconds. Flins' lower limit to his rotation length in most cases is 16 seconds, and within 16 seconds, you will get a little bit over 5 particles on average from Ineffa. About 2/3 of the field time is spent on Flins, so generally, you'll get 3 to 4 particles when he's on field, and 1 to 2 when he's off field. Now, let's say 3 on field, 2 off field. Electro Resonance is 1 electro particle when you trigger a reaction, up to once every 5 seconds. In a 16-second rotation, that can happen 3 times. 2 out of 3 of those are going to be during Flins' uptime, so +2. That's it for electro particles. Sucrose, 4 animal particles about once per rotation, and you use Sucrose's skill and then immediately swap to Flins. So Flins catches those particles. And then Aino is 3 hydro particles, but Flins is not catching them. Clear particles, Favs on the teams is pretty much just Aino generally, so that's 3 particles from the Fav, and I generally assume 2 clear particles from HP thresholds. For a total of just shy of 50 energy, and in order to generate 60 energy from the 48 he gets by default, you will need around 120 to 125% ER. However, if you want to be allowed to use the big burst, what needs to happen is you need to be able to generate this same 60 energy before his uptime is over. All of the particles that Flynn catches stay there, but all of the particles that Flynn does not catch disappear. On top of that, it could be difficult to actually catch the Sucrose particles before you consume the energy from the burst. So these 4 are a little iffy. You might get them, you might not. For now, let's assume that you do. And in this case, his ER requirement goes up to around 160. If you don't catch the Sucrose particles, 175. For now, I'm just gonna assume that you don't, actually. I think that's a safer way to go about it. In other words, if you're not at 175-ish ER, what's gonna happen is if you try to use Flins' burst, you swap to Flins, you use your burst, enter skill, activate Northland Spear Storm, suffocate on energy while attempting to generate 30 energy before the first 6-second window to use your mini burst is over. Maybe just barely get it, then use skill again, and you won't get the second one. What exactly does all of this mean? It effectively means that a Flins with 165 ER is effectively the same as a Flins with 130 ER. But getting 10% more ER enables you to use the big burst, which is a massive upgrade. All of that being said, that still doesn't mean you can always use the big burst, because if you try to use the big burst every rotation, that's just plus 80 to your cost, and your ER requirement is now 300. That shit ain't happening, buddy. And so it becomes a question of, I am building a decent amount of ER on Flins. Do I have enough that I'm allowed to use the big burst? That's what this is telling you. And then the next question is, how often do I use the big burst? If you use it every rotation, ER requirement 287 ain't happening. Every 2 rotations, 204. It's quite a bit higher than this, and generally not really worth going for, but if you are at 205, you will be able to burst every 2 rotations. Every 3 rotations, around 177, which is very similar to this. In other words, if you're just barely at that 175-ish, 180-ish ER requirement, you'll burst every 3 rotations. But if you're at like 195, 198, 200, then you start reaching the point where if you manage to find 1 more roll of ER, you'll be able to burst every 2 rotation instead of every 3 rotations. And that can make 1 roll of ER worth way more than a roll of crit. I really like this aspect of Flins' kit, because the big burst isn't so good that you always want to use it, but it is good enough that it can affect how you want to build him, and it can enable a few different options. I think it's really cool. I think it's actually balanced very well. When I was doing my calcs on Flins' potential options, I looked at both by default. If you don't use the burst, 123. If you do use the burst, 176. The difference between those two is about a little bit over 50%. Well, as it turns out, an ER Sands gives you a little bit over 50% ER, which makes it really easy to compare the 2 setups, right? All you need to do is swap your Sands to ER with the same exact assumptions on everything else, and it lets you look at the big burst rotation versus the non-big burst one. ER Sands burst every 3 rotations versus attack Sands, no big burst. And the balance actually lined up in such a way that on some weapons, attack sans is better, and on others, ER sans is better. And it's never really more than like a 2 or 3% difference between the two. It hit like the perfect balance where both playstyles are about equally as strong as one another. With all of that explanation on his kit out of the way, it is time to do the usual pre-release stuff where we talk about his gear. Let's start with his weapons. He's got a new signature, Bloodsoaked Ruins, high base attack, crit rate, substat. The effect is for 3.5 seconds after using a burst, you increase Lunar Charge damage, and additionally, after triggering Lunar Charge, you gain 28% crit damage, and you regain 12 energy up to once every 14 seconds. On Flins, all of this means 36 Lunar Charge damage, 28 crit damage, and 12 energy. Because there's a lot of nuance to the value of energy on Flins, it's difficult to properly assign a value to energy refund, which is going to mean that his signature is going to vary in power depending on your setup. And it's obviously his best in spawn. It is 30% better than his default free-to-play weapon, the shovel, 25% better than the battle pass weapons, and it's about 15% better than Jade windspear if you have that, and a similar amount on most of the crit stat sticks. Other weapons that we want to talk about, let's talk about the other 5-star stat sticks. So we have Homa. Generally, it's just a normal stat stick. However, as we're going to talk about once we get to the teams, Flins is actually one of the very few characters that has certain setups that can reliably activate the below 50% passive from Homa. In those teams, Homa is his second best option after Sig. Jade windspear is a pretty decent 5-star stat stick. It's not far from Homa above 50% HP. It's pretty close to pretty much all of the other crit stat sticks. He doesn't benefit from the damage percent from Jade windspear, but it still gives you a bit of attack. It's still a crit weapon, high base attack. It's alright. More importantly, because it's a standard weapon, its very existence means that there's a lot less people that should consider getting signature. Because if you have Jade windspear, the upgrade from getting signature is noticeably worse than the upgrade from getting an early constellation. Next up, we have Staff of Scarlet Sands. Staff of Scarlet Sands sounds like it will be really good. It gives you attack based on your EM, and Flins is a character that gets a lot of EM and wants a lot of attack, so it should be great, right? Well, when elemental skill hits opponents, he only has one skill that hits opponents, the Northland Spear Storm, and it only happens twice over his rotation, so he does not get all 3 stacks. He gets either 1 or 2 stacks, so you don't get the full conversion. But on top of that, this is a lie. This does not actually convert 52% of their elemental mastery to bonus attack. It converts 52% of their elemental mastery, excluding buffs that are reliant on the percentage of another character's stat. Sounds complicated, but basically what that means is that this does not work on a lot of the EM buffs you get. As a general rule, if you buff a stat by a percentage of another stat, the new value of that stat won't work on weapons that look at that stat to give a different buff, right? In other words, if I give EM to Kazuha with Sucrose, that EM won't be counted for Kazuha's damage percent. In this case, if I give EM to Flins through his passive that gives him 160 EM, it's a percentage of his attack. Ineffa's passive, 6% of her attack. Sucrose's passive, 20% of her EM. Those 3, ignored. They do not get counted for this, and he does not gain attack from it. All of this to say, Staff of Scarlet Sands, because of the way it's coded, is a little bit better than the other options, as long as you have enough EM rolls in your general artifacts. But it's a crit rate main stat, and we're going to talk about his artifact stats later, but he has options that give him crit rate, so it can make it easy to overcap on crit and lose value that way. Next is Vortex Vanquisher. Flins' best team uses Ineffa. Ineffa gives you a shield. Vortex Vanquisher is a lot stronger if you have a shield than if you don't. Vortex Vanquisher is still not that great, even if you do have a shield. You get 20% attack, doubled when you have a shield, so 40% attack from the passive. That's a bit better than the passives from Homa, from Jade windspear. However, attack substat is much worse than crit substat. So generally, Vortex Vanquisher it's around the same level as a battle pass weapon, sometimes a bit higher, sometimes a bit lower, depending on refine. Calamity Queller, pretty much the same. Okay, 5-star stat stick. You can get the effect, but you don't care about the damage percent from the effect. Next is the energy ones. Because Flins has a playstyle that allows him to capitalize on high ER, are not that bad. That being said, I mentioned earlier that ER Sans burst every 3 rotations is about as good as attack Sans. What that means is that assuming you reach the right ER breakpoints, ER is about as good as attack percent. But I literally just mentioned that attack percent substats are worse than crit substats, which is why Vortex Vanquisher isn't as good as a crit stat sticks. Skyward Spine is pretty much the same thing. Its ER allows you to meet certain breakpoints, and if it does, it's effectively equivalent to attack percent, but its passive isn't that great. It's basically just 8% crit because the physical damage is going to be pathetically low, and the attack speed won't matter on a character whose normal attacks don't do a significant portion of his damage. That being said, assuming it does get you to the right breakpoints, it can be better than the shovel. Engulfing! Engulfing, similar idea. However, just the numbers on Engulfing are a lot better. It provides you with a lot more ER. It provides you with a lot of attack, so much so that it outshines the little bit of crit you get from Skyward Spine. Engulfing Lightning is actually pretty similar to the crit stat sticks overall. Shovel, default free to play. 510 base attack, medium base attack percent substat, and the effect increases Lunar Charge damage, I said that earlier, by 48%. Ballad of the Fjords at R1, slightly better than Shovel, but it's not a particularly big difference, honestly. The biggest problem here is that Flins gets Elemental Mastery from so many external sources, and Elemental Mastery is one of the few stats that actually has real, like, mathematical diminishing returns. The formula for your EM multiplier has a plateau, so at 800 EM, 120 more is about 5% more damage. At 0 EM, 120 more is about 16% more damage, 17%. So that 120 you get isn't that great. Deathmatch is generally slightly better than Fjords. You are saturated on attack percent as well, but it's lower base attack, crit substat, which is nice. And attack is a little bit better than EM generally. So Deathmatch generally ends up around 3 to 4% higher than Fjords. Missive windspear, it's like almost a shovel. It has the same stat line, it just has a different effect. 24% attack, 96 EM instead of 48 Lunar Charge damage. It's like 2% worse than shovel. If you're a free-to-play player who doesn't have 5 billets, or who wants to use the billets to craft a different weapon, and you got Missive windspear back in the day during the event, you don't need to craft shovel. Crafting shovel is a 2% DPS upgrade over Missive windspear, and it's not necessary. Torch! Torch has the same like function and idea as Skyward Spine, where it gives you around 30 ER, so its value depends on your current ER thresholds, but unlike Skyward Spine, it isn't, if you capitalize on the bus, better than Shovel. So generally, just ignore the Torch. But you can use Torch on day 1 if you don't have your Shovel yet. Kitain, same thing. And finally, Favge. My goat. Because Flins has a way to capitalize on extra particles, it means that weapons that give you a lot of energy, like a Refinement 4 or higher Favge, because at Refinement 4 or higher, it can proc twice per uptime, and also provide a lot more value through that. 8 additional particles from 2 Favge procs brings the extra ER requirement, the requirement to just be outright allowed to use burst, to 130.4, and so you need 30.4 ER, and guess how much energy Favge gives you on the substat? 30.6. So on Favge, you can use the big burst, and then the question becomes, how often? By default, it'll be every 4 rotations. However, your build is very likely to have some ER substats. If you're at 140 ER, you'll be able to burst every 3 rotations. If you're at 165 ER, you'll be able to burst every 2 rotations. And you can't burst every rotation even if you meet this ER requirement, because the burst cooldown is 20 seconds and your skill cooldown is 16, and you generally want to do 16-second cooldown, or 16-second rotations. Another nice thing about Favge is because this basic requirement is so damn low, you can use your big burst at a moment other than right as soon as you swap the Flins. You end up generating so many particles that if your burst isn't quite full at the start of your rotation, you just do E, and you do your Northland Spear Storm, your mini burst, but then you generate a ton more energy from the Favge and all your particles, and then you can use the big burst before your skill cooldown is back. And then you use the skill again, and you don't need to use the second mini burst right afterwards. You have 6 seconds to use it, so you can just regenerate your energy and then use the mini burst. While energy is not an insanely good stat on Flins, it's not a bad one either. Generally, it's worth a similar amount as attack percent. On the same 123.5 ER build that we had by default without the Favge, we'll be at 153 with the Favge, which allows us to use a burst of about once every 2.5 rotations. Without Favge, our ER requirement to do the same thing would be 188.5. That means that the Favonius effect plus passive is providing you with about 80% ER's worth of stats. 80% ER is a lot. It's a very large amount. And as it turns out, that is actually enough for it to be pretty competitive with Shovel. It's actually less than a 1% difference between Favge and Shovel, with Favge actually being the one that's a little bit higher. Though, because you end up playing a different rotation, slightly different assumptions could very much tip the scales in either of the weapons' favor. The point I'm getting at here, though, is just Favge is actually a good weapon on Flins, and if it has pretty much the same DPS as Shovel for Flins personal damage, the fact that it reduces your ER requirements on the rest of your teams means that it will be higher DPS. The reality is that, in most cases, Favge is actually Flins' best free-to-play 4-star weapon. However, Favge is every goddamn polearm character's best free-to-play polearm, so you shouldn't use your Favge on Flins, especially because in order for it to be as good as I said it is, it needs to be R4 or higher. You need to be able to proc the effect twice per rotation. So you shouldn't use Favge on him. However, I will use Favge on him, okay? Favge is my goat. Let's order these weapons from best to worst. Say that Bloodsoaked Ruins first, then Staff of Scarlet Sands, then Homa, then Jade Windspear and other crit stat sticks, then Engulfing, then honestly Favge. Not that you should do it, but that's where I'd put it. Then Deathmatch, then Vortex, Vanquisher, Calamity, Queller, Skyward Spine, then Fjords. I guess I should have these above. Maybe not Skyward Spine, maybe because Skyward Spine is like, it's a bit harder to meet the specific condition for it to be as good as it can be. And then these. Next, artifact sets. First, let's get this out of the way. His best set is Night of the Skies Unraveling. It's a new non-cry carry set. The Sky set gives you 80 elemental mastery. It gives you 30% crit rate if you've triggered a lunar reaction in the past few seconds, if you're in Ascendant Gleam, which you will be. And it increases your lunar reaction damage by 10% for your whole team. The 10% is additive with the EM multiplier, so it's not like times 1.1. It's not a particularly big increase, but it is there. The Sky is his best set. It's obviously designed for him and other characters like him, but it's a new set, so most people, well, literally everyone doesn't have one yet. And most people won't have a good one by the time the rest of their Flins, right, the talents, everything is ready. So what are your other options? Marie-José Hunter. Marie-José Hunter, if you can actually activate it, is actually about as good as Sky. It gives you 6% more crit rate and some damage that you don't care that much about. You don't have the EM or the Lunar Charge damage, but because his EM is so saturated already, it's actually slightly better for his personal damage. But it's so close that the 10% Lunar Charge damage increasing Ineffa's damage brings Sky like point-something% better than Marie-José, assuming Marie-José gets activated. The problem is, Marie-José doesn't get activated. The way to activate Marie-José is by using Farina, and you can use Farina in Flins' teams, but you will generally be using Farina without her burst. You won't be using her burst, and you won't be using a healer, because he doesn't care that much about the damage percent, the burst animation is long, and Flins doesn't have access to great healer options outside of the Hydro slot itself instead of Farina. So you kind of can't use Marie-José, unfortunately. Next is just the default stat sticks. Right, Gilded Dream, 2-piece. They're okay. They're pretty noticeably behind his signature set, so they're not ideal. And finally, it's propaganda time. All right, let's talk about Thundering Fury. We've talked about how Flins' Northland Spearstorm cannot have its cooldown reduced. However, the actual skill of the Ancient Rite Arcane Light, the 16-second cooldown, can be reduced. In other words, if you use Thundering Fury, your rotation length becomes potentially shorter than 16 seconds. It allows you to do rotations with 15, 14, maybe even 13 seconds per rotation. You're still gated by the rest of your team. However, there's a few options that can allow you to get it anyways. Aino's cooldowns, 13.5. Sucrose TTDS cooldown is 20. By default, you get it every other rotation anyways, so it's not really a problem. She does have a 15-second skill cooldown. However, if you have C1 Sucrose and you do 14-second rotations, it'll take you 15 rotations to reach a point where you don't have a skill available. So that's not a problem. Ineffa's skill cooldown is 16, and her burst cooldown is 15. However, just like Fischl, Ineffa can use her burst to refresh her skill duration. You don't get the shield back, but that's not the end of the world, honestly. Which means, in Flins' premium team, you can use TF to bring your basic rotation length down from 16 to 15, 14, maybe even 13 if you're using a character like Farina, skill every other rotation. Now, Unfortunately, pretty much since Fontaine, signature sets are good enough that they're generally providing too much value for sets like TF to be that good. But outside of the signature set, TF actually will be your next best option. Because just in terms of damage, it's very similar to a 2-piece or gilded. It's like a 1 or 2% behind. But in terms of DPS, well, it's much higher because your rotations can be 1, 2, maybe even 3 seconds shorter. Which means that on release, before you get yourself a Sky set, Flins' best set will be TF. Next up is Artifact Stats. Artifact Stats are very straightforward. Attack, crit. Or ER, attack, crit. Lunar Charge damage doesn't scale with damage percent. Damage percent is not good. It's not completely worthless. His talent damage outside of Lunar Charge is low, but it's not completely insignificant. It's still about 10% of his damage. So if you have the choice between getting damage percent and getting nothing, you'd rather get damage percent. It's not like getting, I don't know, attack on Molani or some shit. But it's not particularly good. And it's definitely not something you should consider on your main stats. You can use EM main stats, kind of, but it's generally worse than attack main stats by like 3 to 4 substats. So it needs to be an insane EM main stat for it to be better than an attack main stat. If you have Salva Scarlet Sands, it makes EM main stat a bit better, but it's still not better than attack main stat. But as a general rule, stick to these two. And finally is teams. Flins only really has one team. He is an energy reliant carry, so he really wants to be played with another Electro character, and half of his kit just straight up doesn't work if you don't have a Hydro character on the team to trigger Lunar Charge, which doesn't leave you that much flexibility for the last slot. Generally, that last slot is just going to be a buffer, right? So instead of looking at teams individually, we're just going to assume you're doing his one team, and you have the Electro characters, you have the Hydro characters, and you have the buffers. Ineffa is his best support. She's the support that is the most important to his teams. If you don't have Ineffa, your next best option is like 20% behind, and it's a pretty noticeable difference. That being said, it's a new major version, so there are going to be new players coming into the game that didn't play when Ineffa came out. There's also going to be players that didn't have enough primos to get Ineffa, or weren't sure if they were going to get Flins and decided later, so they didn't get Ineffa. If that's you, are you completely cooked? Not necessarily. Ineffa is a 5-star character. Getting one copy of Ineffa takes the same amount of wishes as getting a copy of any other given 5-star character, and a C1 Flins team with a 4-star Electro actually does a similar amount of DPS as a C0 Flins team with Ineffa. So just all other factors being equal, getting 2 copies of Flins versus 1 copy of Flins plus 1 copy of Ineffa gets you a pretty similar amount of team DPS. So you're not completely cooked, but another way to look at it is, well, Flins has a pretty good C1, and Ineffa does as much for him as his C1 does. So it's a pretty big difference if you have it versus if you don't. Your other Electro options, it's kind of weird. The general alternatives are Ororon. One thing I think a lot of people will get confused on is the artifact set. Damage percent is not good on Flins. However, 40 is a much larger number than 20. As it turns out, because it's a much larger number, despite the stat being a bit less valuable, you still want to run scrolls over the other support sets on Ororon. It's actually the same for pretty much every Natlan support you can use. Scrolls is still generally slightly better than either Noblesse or TOM or whatever else you could use. Next is Iansan. With Iansan, Flins is not a character that moves a lot. However, we've talked about how pathetic his normal attack damage is. What that means is that if you want to just run around like a headless chicken to keep your nice hold up in between the normal attacks that you do to generate energy every 2 seconds, you can, and you don't really lose any damage. In other words, while Iansan is pretty stupid, she can work. Now, the scrolls isn't that good. The C6 isn't that good. But an attack buff is an attack buff, and so Iansan is okay. The biggest problem with Iansan is that her burst cooldown is 18 seconds, which forces you into longer rotations. And that's actually a pretty big deal. Next, Electro MC. If you don't have Ineffa, Electro MC is your next best option. Electro MC's burst is a 20-second cooldown, but you can just use it every other rotation. Electro MC is a character that gives you a lot of energy. Let's take a look at ER requirements for burst every other rotation on Flins. Wow, very cool. Let's take a look at what happens when you add EMC into the mix. We also need to add extra ER because EMC gives the ER stat directly. So, EMC gives like 50% ER. EMC refunds 4 energy per amulet, 3 amulets per rotation, doubled effectiveness on the first one. So that's 24 plus 12, 36 flat energy, plus what you get on the burst, which is going to be about another 18. So that's about 50. Well, let's just round it down to 50 flat energy per 2 rotations. We do get a bit less particles because Ineffa is not there anymore, but we get an additional Favge proc. EMC provides Flins with the equivalent of about 75% ER. We said earlier, ER is, assuming you capitalize on it properly, about equivalent to attack percent. 75% ER would be the equivalent of 65 to 70% attack. And a character that gives that, that's not awful. Yeah, as it turns out, Electro MC is the next best option after Ineffa. The problem is, Electro MC is too difficult to play. I don't think there is a single person in the world who will be able to reliably do proper rotations on Electro MC. You need to be close enough to the enemy that all 3 of your cone-shaped elemental skill hits to collide with the enemy, but far enough not to pick them up immediately. After which, you need to go to your other characters to do the rest of your setup and make sure that you don't accidentally pick any of the amulets up on any of those. If you're using Aino, she has a skill that makes her move. Good luck dodging the amulets, buddy. But you have to use Aino because Electro MC isn't Nodcry, and you need to activate the Ascendant Gleam effect. Then, you need to swap to Flins and make sure that you use the burst to consume your energy before you pick up the amulets, because otherwise you just lose the value. After which, you need to make sure you pick up all of the amulets, which will be literally impossible if the enemy's hitbox just goes over them. And on top of all of that, you need to be at the right amount of ER, at the right ER breakpoint, to be able to use your burst every other rotation. If any of those factors isn't met, Electro MC tanks, and it's basically just an awful character. Hence the, oh god, technically best option, but not real at all. Then you have the other alternatives. Mainly you're thinking about the healers, Kuki or Dori, but it's mainly Kuki. You don't really want to use Kuki. You'd rather use a healer on a different slot, namely the Hydro slot. So what's the Hydro slot? Generally, I know the Hydro slot is the most flexible one. It's kind of like the last slot in a Skirk team in that there's just no good one, so it doesn't really matter what you use. I know as a character who has a synergy with Flins, but is awful. And as a character with good synergy but bad numbers, she's just okay. C6 Aino is technically the best option, but it's like 0.1% ahead of the next best option. Xilonen is probably the character whose kit just works the best. However, 18-second burst cooldown, plus 2-second rotation length, unlucky. You have Farina, 20-second skill cooldown, no. However, 30-second skill duration. You can use Farina's skill every other rotation. If you do Farina's skill every other rotation, you don't use Farina burst, you are permanently at or below 50% HP, which activates the Homa passive. But if you have Homa, Farina's even better. Farina will be the best last slot if you're on Homa, and this is no burst for Farina. Then Candace C6. It needs to be C6 because you need the Hydro application from the C6 triggers, otherwise it doesn't work. She's basically about as good. Mona, I don't recommend Mona. It sounds like it would be good if you have constellations on her, right? Her C4 is crit, her C1 is Lunar Charge damage bonus, but the numbers just aren't good enough and the uptime is dog shit, so she's just not very good. And now we have the abominations. Kokomi. Your Hydro slots are so completely awful that a character that just does no damage, doesn't provide you with anything because you already have TTDS on Sucrose from their kit directly other than Hydro application, is actually about as good as I know. Problem with Kokomi is kill cooldown, but you can solve that with sac frag. Next is Barbara. Exact same shit as Kokomi. Just off-field Hydro application. Skill cooldown that's too long, so you fix it with sac frag. Needs R5 sac frag to work in 16-second rotations. But Barbara can move, unlike Kokomi's skill. So I'd actually lean a little bit more towards Barbara over Kokomi. Sigewinne! First Sigewinne W I've ever seen. Sigewinne's skill follows you around. Like, it follows the enemy around. Her application is kind of dog shit, but Flins doesn't need fast application. You just need Hydro every, like, 4 seconds, and it's kind of just good enough. And Sigewinne's skill isn't stationary, but also, if you don't get your sac proc on Barbara, you are cooked. On Sigewinne, if you don't get your sac proc, it's only an 18-second cooldown. It's not that bad. But no one has Sigewinne, so it doesn't really matter. But if you're a Sigewinne lover and you want to have a team where you can use her and she feels good to use, she'll feel pretty good to use here. And finally, this is probably the biggest abomination on this list. Xingqiu. Xingqiu in a normal rotation, 21-second skill cooldown, not very good. It extends your rotation by 5 seconds. It's way too much. It's just not worth it. However, Xingqiu's skill applies Hydro, just like Barbara, which means you can use burst every other rotation on Xingqiu. And it's still, it's about as good as Xilonen. It's about as good as Aino. It's about as good as Farina. It's about as good as Candace C6. It's okay. It's a bit more damage than the healer options, and a bit more defensive utility than the damage-only options. I'm happy that Xingqiu is usable in the team, because I feel like they've gone so hard on characters that just don't work well with Xingqiu lately, and Xingqiu's my goat. But not like this. This isn't what I wanted. Burst every other rotation Xingqiu, where you do one rotation burst, one rotation skill, and you alternate between the two, is an abomination. It should not exist. I don't like it. Finally, we have buffers. Sucrose is the best buffer by a pretty decent margin. Sucrose gives you stuff you want. You want Shred, you want EM, you want attack from TTDS. Good stuff. The other buffers are fine, right? You can use Xilonen. Xilonen is okay. Her Shred is full uptime, so you have better uptime on your Shred for Ineffa's damage, although it'll be pretty much the same for Flins. She provides a bit more energy because she goes Favge, and more importantly, she can heal. The default premium team for Flins is Flins, Ineffa, Sucrose, Hydroflex. And if the Hydroflex you're using isn't a healer, you don't have any healing on the team. So Xilonen being a functional character here matters a lot. However, Xilonen is worse than Sucrose by a noticeable amount. So you are sacrificing something for healing. And if you want healing, you're generally better off sacrificing the slightly higher damage from your Hydro slot for healing on a Hydro healer than the damage from Sucrose. Next is Bennett. Bennett is also okay. Pretty similar to Xilonen. It's a little bit worse, but if you end up getting Shred somehow, either because you're against an enemy that has negative resistances, for example, the Cactus boss that's currently in Sigewinne Onslaught, when you break its shield in the hat phase, it becomes vulnerable for like 1 rotation's worth of time, and during that time, its resistances are set to minus 90%. And so Shred becomes a lot less valuable. And in those situations, Bennett is actually better than Sucrose. Outside of that, you can get Shred from Vertical Investment Flins from his C2. At C2, Bennett is about as good as Sucrose, but he's a healer, unlike Sucrose, so he will be slightly better. Honestly, I would not recommend using anyone other than these three, I guess, unless you don't have Sucrose and Bennett is used somewhere else and you don't have Xilonen. At that point, just put Aoife doing 1 normal attack and swap out or some shit. But we can quickly talk about the other ones, right? We got Loma. Loma is actually a decent option, but unfortunately, the fact that Loma's Ascension passive doesn't increase Hyperbloom damage when you're in Ascendant Gleam, and the fact that triggering Lunar Charge through a Quicken skips the first instance of Lunar Charge damage. It's aura stuff, it's kind of complicated, but know that you won't get as much Lunar Charge reaction damage itself with Loma. Those things together make it so that Loma's not that great. But she is viable, and if you want to play Flins in content that favors Bloom stuff, favors Dendro, you can use Loma with them. Other than that, you can use Lanyan. If you don't have Ineffa as a shielder option, it's okay. But even if you do have Ineffa, if you don't have Sucrose, I'd probably use Lanyan over your other alternatives. It'll be pretty similar to using Bennett. Kazuha, no. Don't use Kazuha. Kazuha is so much worse. Longer animations and worse buffs. You shouldn't use it. C2R1 Kazuha provides less stats to Flins than Sucrose does. And it has longer animations. Don't use Kazuha. You can use Iansan if you're like really cooked, really low on options. It works. Not ideal. You can use Venti if you want grouping. All things considered, the team doesn't lose that much DPS from using Venti. For now, I'm assuming that you could properly hit the enemies in Venti Burst. I guess I'll have to test that, but if you can, then Venti will be okay. You can use Zhongli if you want a more comfortable shield. But honestly, just put the Sucrose in the bag. Welcome to the sugar factory. Put the Sucrose in the bag and move on. Last thing is Chevars. When you're in content that allows you to trigger Lunar Charge without a Hydro unit on the team, for example, against a Hydro Tulpa, you don't need a Hydro anymore, which means you are now allowed to use Chevreuse teams. And when you can, Flins in a Chevreuse team is really, really good, but only against Hydro-infused enemies like Tulpa. Constellations. C1 decreases the Northland Spear Storm cooldown to 4 seconds. You can get 3 skills and therefore 3 mini bursts instead of 2. You also recover 8 energy whenever you trigger Lunar Charge, up to once every 5.5 seconds, so that's generally 3 times per rotation. So 24 energy, but 1 more mini burst, which costs 30, which effectively means that he needs to generate 66 energy instead of 60, which increases his ER requirements. This makes it so that the big burst playstyle kind of dies, because it's really difficult to fit a big burst in a rotation that also does 3 mini bursts. So that kind of removes that aspect, but it also slightly increases the energy that he needs to get all his burst stuff. So he doesn't need need access to the big burst playstyle as much. Overall, this is around a 20% team DPS increase. It's somewhere between 20 and 25 generally. For Flins' personal DPS, it's like 30+%. C1 is generally better than R1. R1 and C1 are fairly similar if you're starting from Shovel, but most people that consider vertical investment on Flins have a stat stick they can use on him, and if you do, C1 is much better. C2, the next 6 seconds after using Northland Spear Storm, his next normal attack will deal 50% of his attack as Lunar Charge AoE electro damage. Basically, 50 more motion value to his mini burst. It's not actually on the mini burst, it's on a normal attack before or after the mini burst. It's alright. That part is about 10% more DPS. Also, while Flins is on the field in Ascended Gleam, when his electro attacks hit opponents, the opponent's electro res will be decreased by 25% for 7 seconds. Now, since he stays on field for about 10 seconds, and the rotations are 16 seconds, this is permanent uptime. It lasts for 7 seconds, so it'll stay there forever, basically. And this is also about a 10% DPS increase. So both of them together is about 20%. It's a similar percentage increase to what the C1 gives, which means that the C1 versus R1 comparison also applies to C2 versus R1. C3, burst talent level. Because most of his damage is from the burst, and the talent level increases your value to 142.9, 207.9. 17% increase to the motion value of the Lunar Charge. This generally translates to 10-ish% more DPS. That's when getting R1 from a stat stick becomes better than getting a constellation. So the C3 is generally not as good as getting R1. C4, 20% attack, 60 more EM. It's around 7%. C5 is less than 1%. The skill talent levels are worthless. And C6 is a multiplicative 35 plus 10 Lunar Charge damage for him and 10 for the rest of the team. This is about a 35-ish% team DPS increase. All in all, Flins has some pretty good constellations, all things considered. His C1 and 2 are fairly good. 3 and 4 are like pretty whatever. 5 is pathetic, and 6 is pretty good. But he's a character that's gonna feel kind of like Molani in that the early constellations, it increases damage by quite a bit. Not by quite as much as Molani, but it's a similar idea. That being said, he's honestly good enough at C0, so the constellations are far from necessary. And that pretty much does it for the pre-release stuff. Overall, Flins is going to be a pretty good character, but not an amazing one. If you compare him to the early Natlan characters, he is better. But if you compare him to the late Natlan characters, he's as good or worse. Everything considered, his premium teams deal a very similar amount of DPS as Veresa's premium teams. He's just about as strong overall. But Veresa's premium teams aren't as reliant on any other given 5-star, but in exchange, Flins' teams aren't reliant on 4-star constellations. It's also very likely that Flins will get increases in his team's power from future character releases, namely Columbina. But that might happen to Veresa with Durin as well, so who knows. Overall, I'd say that Flins is an indicator that they're probably going to continue the power creep trend in non-cry. He's not so strong that he's power creep himself, but he is strong enough that unless Columbina just isn't a support, Columbina will probably make his team's power creep. I think he's got a pretty interesting kit. Initially, I thought it was kind of just a copy-paste with Veresa, and to some extent, it kind of still is, but unlike Veresa, he has an actual reason to use his big burst, which I think is really nice. Much like Veresa, though, the fact that he doesn't need to have his full energy to use his mini burst allows for him to hold energy for future rotations if his ER requirements are higher than his current ER is. It allows him to not have to give up about ER at all if you're in Abyss where you start with full energy. It allows for more versatility in rotations. But yeah, all in all, Flins looking fairly interesting. I'm pretty excited. As usual, I hope you learned a thing or two. As a reminder, go check out the guide if there's any questions you have that I haven't answered already in this video. I'll leave a link in the description, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.